Welcome to Conversations. My name is Jason Plotkin, and I am the Program Director at Congregation Emanu. On select Wednesdays throughout the year, we sit down with a member of the community, perhaps our congregation, or even the sports world to discuss the current state of affairs. Congregation Emanu, we pride ourselves on the relationships we have in the community with a wide range of organizations, but particularly our interfaith partnerships. While we're recording this episode a week before the Christmas holiday, this episode will air the day before Christmas Eve. As a congregational community, we've been through our significant holidays in our Jewish calendar during COVID, and Christmas is certainly one in the Christian faith that brings families and communities together. I thought that there would be benefit in learning from one of our congregation's dear friends, one of our neighbors, ahead of the Christmas holiday, and we're grateful today to have Reverend Neil Willard of Palmer Memorial Episcopal Church join us today. Reverend Willard, you can come on our broadcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you for the invitation.
Well, again, we are so happy to have you. Before we dive in, and we have a wide range of things to talk about, I would really love for our audience to learn a bit about your background. Obviously, some people who are watching are probably a bit more familiar with you than others. But if you don't mind sharing, please share with us a bit about yourself and the road that brought you to Palmer.
Right off the bat, I am not a native Texan, so this is all new to me. I have deep roots in the state of North Carolina, and also not in the Episcopal Church, but in the Moravian Church, which is a very old, but also very small Protestant tradition within Christianity. And so that's how I was raised, outside the area around Winston-Salem. I went to college not too far from home at Wake Forest University, and then off to Yale Divinity School. And then I spent a year as the bishop's clerk in the Episcopal Diocese of Virginia. And then I've served churches as a priest in the Episcopal Church in Surfside Beach, South Carolina, which is basically South Myrtle Beach, and then Hilton Head Island. And then moved to Williamsburg, Virginia, where it was really great fun to serve on the clergy staff of Bruton Parish Church. And that's the old colonial church right in the heart of colonial Williamsburg. That was a lot of fun. That's where I met my wife, Carrie. Then we moved to Minnesota. She's from Wisconsin, so that's kind of how we ended up in the upper Midwest. And that's where both of our boys were born. And then we moved to Houston, Texas. And I never expected to live in any of those places. I thought I'd spend my whole life in North Carolina. I've never served a church, never worked for the Episcopal Church in North Carolina.
It's really fascinating how we always end up in places we never thought we would end up.
Exactly.
For those who are watching in the Houston area, they're probably pretty familiar with your location. Palmer is literally on the edge of Herman Park, Rice University, and of course the large Texas Medical Center. And you were telling me earlier you have Rice University literally in your background. But as a leader of an institution, being at such a cross section of life here in the Houston area, what are some of the advantages being in that spot as it relates to the outreach and connection to the community that you may have?
It's a remarkable spot. And by the way, I love, I never thought I'd have the opportunity to lead a congregation that's a university church. That's such a rare thing, and you don't really get to choose that. And so I feel extremely grateful to be, but we have that and other things. In normal times, you'd see across the street in the park, children playing together, adults spending time outdoors. If you look back to the museum district, you can reflect on the world as it was created and how human beings have shaped it through the centuries. And over at Rice, of course, you have intellectual curiosity. And then, we're directly across the street from the largest medical complex in the world, where there's constantly research happening, healing taking place. And I think that as a religious community, as a Christian church at the center of all that, it's a powerful thing to be able to affirm all of that and to say that, to Houstonians, hey, you may or may not believe this, but we believe that God is involved in all of these things. We're here to bear witness to that, to give thanks to that, and to, maybe invite people to make some of those connections for themselves. In normal times, in the before times, one of the most powerful things that we ever do in public, specifically because of our location, happens on Ash Wednesday. And that is the day on the Christian calendar that begins the season of Lent. And that's a period of weeks in which Christians prepare themselves for the to celebrate the events leading up to Easter Day and the Easter season. And so on Ash Wednesday, Christians are asked to reflect on their mortality, and they're reminded that they are dust, and to dust they shall return. You shall return. And so in addition to the services that we do inside of the church, on Ash Wednesday, our clergy and a lot of our parishioners, and this is slightly controversial, not all churches do this, not all churches would approve of this, but a lot of our parishioners will put on vestments and put on a robe and go out onto the sidewalks and in the intersections around the church and be available to offer a prayer for people if invited to do so. And then also participate in what's called the imposition of ashes. And that's, you've probably seen people walk around in the spring on a random day in the spring with ashes on their forehead, again, being reminded you are dust, and to dust you shall return. And it's really a powerful thing. I mean, they're stuck in traffic on Fannin Street. They'll roll down their windows and wait for people to come over. There are all sorts of people who work in the Memorial Hermann Medical Plaza, and they look out the windows and they see what's happening down there. They'll come down in groups and all want to stand in line to have that prayer on that day. There are patients or parents of children who are headed into the medical center will pull into the church parking lot. Something's happening. They're not able to be at a church on that special day, but they want to have a prayer right before they go into the medical center. And it's really one of the most moving things that happens around here that involves people from throughout the congregation, and it really is specific to being where we are. Every day, even if you're inside the church at a service, you can often hear the life flight helicopters landing, across the intersection at Memorial Hermann. And now that we're doing outside services, we'll come back to that, but often, right as we're having the most important prayers of our services, you'll hear those helicopters coming overhead and landing. And it's really a moving thing to be reminded of, having a service of prayer in the midst of the world, not as we wish it to be, but as it really is. And I think it's just something really powerful about that.
Yeah, that really is fascinating when we see life flight, we live not too far from here. We always are thinking about the person
exactly
that they're taking care of. And, I can imagine, as we pray for healing and peace and things like that, to see something like that, literally while you're doing those prayers, It can be quite powerful. Another thing about your location is you have access to the Metro Rail. I sit on the Super Neighborhood Board. You and I have sat in on various community meetings, and the homelessness population seems to gravitate to the rail because it's ease of access to other places. And I think Palmer has had a very significant role over the years as it relates to the homelessness population here in Houston. For those not familiar with your church's role, do you mind giving some insight into what Palmer has done over the years?
Yeah, especially for those who maybe moved to Houston in the last 5 years, because before that, for nearly a quarter of a century, Palmer fed the homeless in our courtyard every morning of the work week. And it was called the Way Station. And a lot of people, if they knew nothing else about the church, they knew about the Way Station. That homeless ministry served more than 1 million meals to folks over those years. That was thanks to volunteers, not only from our church, but from the community who wanted to be a part of that too. So that came to an end in 2015 as part of Houston's overall blueprint to reduce homelessness, and through housing and coordinated services that are close to the housing. And I think that last part was really an important thing to understand about what we were doing and then what we transitioned away from. So they wanted the feeding programs to be near where people were being housed. And if you mapped everything out, we were real outliers in kind of the uncoordinated system of providing services to homeless. Maybe that's a charitable way to put it. We were really far outside of things. And so people came here for breakfast, but then, there's sort of a migration toward downtown for lunch and other things. You just have people constantly moving around. But the other factor, and those who are around here will remember this, that accelerated that shift was the emergence of the street drug Kush. And that meant that abusers of that drug began to intermingle with the chronically homeless. And then they were both being served at the way station. And that made the environment around Palmer actually less safe than it had been previously. Because, some of the people trying to take advantage of the drug users, that was not safe for the homeless too. So, and we also have on our campus, a lot of people will know that Archway Academy finds its home here. It's the largest high school in the United States for adolescents in recovery from drug and alcohol abuse. So having all of that drug influence around the church at the same time when that's happening on our campus was also not a great thing. And so, again, working with the city's plan, that transitioned away from Palmer so that those feeding programs were closer to where people were being housed. But a lot of Palmers are still involved in that kind of ministry through activities at New Hope Housing, which is where a lot of the formerly homeless have found a home now. So some of that still continues.
And for those who are curious, we had Mark Eichenbaum, who's the homeless czar for the city,
yes,
on our program. He's a member of the congregation. That's available in our archives. And it's very fascinating to hear and learn about the coordinated efforts that were just referenced by Reverend Willard. But, it's Palmer has played a significant role in the history of the homeless population, particularly in this side of the city. Talking about relationships, at the onset of the conversation, I mentioned Emmanuel having pride in its interfaith partnerships. I would be remiss if I did not mention the relationship that you have with Rabbi Hion and some of the surrounding clergy. What do these professional relationships and personal friendships mean to you and your work as a clergy member here?
It's been really great. It's been really important to me. And I have several of these circles, a couple of which in a way didn't really start intentionally, other than when I arrived here, neighbors and colleagues wanted to welcome me to Houston. And one of those was having the three Christian clergy and Rabbi Hion together. Well, he wasn't here yet, the interim rabbi from Congregation Emmanuel. So I was the new Christian minister, the other two pastors and the interim rabbi, we all got together. And then we just kept meeting every month. And so I don't know that we started out with that idea, but it was really important for us to continue that. And since then, since I've arrived here, we welcomed, there's a new rabbi, there's a new pastor at Christ the King Lutheran Church. And so we've actually had transition within that group, but we all have in common the setting around Rice University. So we're university congregations. We have our own differences even if you're just looking at the Christian congregations, but in general, we kind of look at the world the same way. And so there's a lot of similarities. And I think that's probably the group that I'm the most honest in because of those relationships. And so it's really a wonderful thing to have a circle of friendships like that is outside of your own tradition. And maybe you would say things there that you wouldn't say in the group of colleagues within your own tradition. To me, I find that really a helpful thing to know that that's there.
Well, that's really neat. We're going to turn our conversation a bit to COVID, and we'll get to Christmas in a little bit. But in March, when things were starting to shut down, I think that we all found ourselves with hurdles and challenges that we probably didn't expect, and a really rapid timeline. I don't think
it was quick.
I don't think any of us expected it to hit like that, right? So what were some of the notable hurdles that you had at the onset when transitioning to whatever, earlier you framed it up, but what were some of those hurdles that you experienced?
So we were in the season of Lent last spring, again, that season of preparation before Easter. And we were, for several weeks, we were getting, I'm in a hierarchical tradition, so we were getting specific guidelines from our bishop that applied to all the Episcopal churches in the Diocese of Texas. And, and it started off with not shaking hands in church. And things of that nature. And then in our ritual of Holy Communion, people would normally receive both consecrated bread and wine as a part of that ritual. And so one of the first things that happened as well along the way was not having the chalice shared with other people, because we use a common cup. And obviously you can, there's all kinds of discussions around that. But it really was quick. I remember the week that we transitioned away from in-person worship in mid-March, and we had gotten some updated guidelines from the bishop on a Thursday, which is how most bishops were doing that. But, you can even imagine in your kind of cycle of weekly events, they were doing the best they could, but, it'd be nice to get those guidelines a few days earlier because you kept having to retool things for the weekend. And I remember getting updated guidelines on a Thursday, and then less than 24 hours later, we got the message that should be no in-person worship on the following Sunday. And it just happened so quickly. And we managed to do a live stream of a service from inside of Palmer on that Sunday morning. And I marvel that we even were able to do that. And I will say that that first Sunday, I can't believe it worked as well as it did, although it felt like inside the church, if you had photographs of it, it sort of felt like a set on a movie of some kind of wartime broadcast from London during the Blitz or something. I mean, that's kind of the feel that it had to it. And it was very, very strange to look out onto empty pews from the pulpit.
Earlier you mentioned that you're doing outside worship. Emmanuel, for those who are watching, in late October started allowing some in-person worship. And then we took a step back right after Thanksgiving as things started, unfortunately, heading in the wrong direction. And even amongst our colleagues here in town, our other synagogues, we're not all on the same page with where we are. We have different thought processes, different medical professionals involved, and we might be a step ahead, step behind. We're all over the place. But what has Palmer done to allow in-person worship opportunities while still connecting? You mentioned doing a stream from an empty church, and it felt, interesting. And I'm sure it still does for clergy, and we'll kind of get to that in our next question. But what were you able to do to allow some in-person worship, and then what were you able to do to connect that to those on the periphery, if you will?
Sure. So, I mean, if going back a little bit, I'll say we quickly switched from streaming a live stream to several weeks later to doing pre-recorded services. For us, that was just going to work better. And then some churches will do a complete recording of a service, with a small group of people in the church. And then that's their pre-recorded service. Ours is more like a quilt where, the two members of the clergy are doing the liturgical parts, and then the musical parts are done separately, and we're keeping people kind of separated within the building. So ours is done a little bit differently, and that continues and will continue for a while until some point in the next year when we switch to live streaming, what seems like a more normal gathering. But that's a lot of work, as you know, because it's like doing church twice every week. So we have things that we're pre-recording something, and then in some cases we're offering an in-person opportunity, which is just it's like it's doing church twice. So over the summer, the Episcopal Diocese of Texas, there was more freedom of the parishes to choose kind of how they would navigate some of this compared to the spring. And again, like you said, in our context, it's the same thing. Not everyone's on the same page, and a lot of churches decided that they would offer some form of in-person worship on a limited basis with all kinds of COVID-19 protocols being followed, beginning in early September, as we would sort of normally begin our program year with the school year, kind of tracking that. We decided that based on conversations with the medical professionals in our own congregation, we have an epidemiologist who specializes in infectious diseases, Kathy Troisi, and she's interviewed every week all over the country, and other medical professionals who work in the Texas Medical Center, that one of our guidelines would be the test positivity rate as it is posted by the Texas Medical Center, which is a little different than the one for the whole county. And that if that was below 5% for 14 days, then we would offer a limited indoor kind of gathering, very small. But before that, we did a test of an outdoor gathering as I was approaching that, but we weren't quite there. And what happened was people came to that and then they said, we are really more comfortable with this. So even when it goes down below 5%, we would actually really, we're only going to come to an outdoor gathering. And so we changed up our plan so that even when it went below 5%, we only offered one service indoors. It's very limited. And we offered 2 services outdoors because that was meeting most people's needs. And then more recently, the one indoor service flipped to outside because the test positivity rate went up. So that's how we're thinking about it. And we're continuing the outdoor gatherings for the time being.
It's all very fascinating, and David Tanner, who's our AV guy behind the glass, if you will, is always I feel like you're learning new skills and putting new skills to use that we didn't need before, and it's just enhancing, hopefully, and giving us some new ideas about how we can proceed. You mentioned earlier doing church twice. So my next question is, while I have some insight because, I'm in meetings with the clergy here at our synagogue and talk to clergy all the time, I'm going to safely presume that many of those watching have either experienced a service on a digital platform, or maybe been one of the few people to be in person at a service opportunity. So the experience is quite different than what it was when we had full rooms prior to COVID. So as a member of the clergy, what have you found is your biggest personal challenge in doing the work that may have just felt almost every day, really, happenstance prior to COVID? What's really been a change or challenge for you that maybe you haven't adjusted to?
Well, to use that awful word televangelist, that was not on my list of goals when I was in seminary or anywhere along the way since then. And there is no doubt, certainly in our experience, that you experience a worship service differently that's gathered together physically, and when you're doing that, and like you said, it's just part of your life. The prayers and the music and the sermon and the rituals flow together with all of their imperfections, right? In fact, most of those you don't even see or you don't even notice. I mean, it's just part of what you do as a community. And, with the shift, in our case, to pre-recorded services, it definitely felt like every mistake, and that is not the right word to use, but it's just the word that comes to mind. Every little thing that was slightly off, it felt like all those things were put under a microscope. And so if you're pre-recording things, you can stop and start over, right? Which is good and bad. And that might be the beginning of the sermon or the first part of the prayers at the altar, which is our custom to chant at Palmer. And I have one, little anecdote to share about that in one of our recent worship videos. This is really one of the first times this happened throughout the whole pandemic. The part where a priest leads the congregation saying the creed, the little summary of Christian faith, it accidentally included the first attempt at that, which included a slip of the tongue, and then rolled right into the second attempt, which was just right, so to speak. And actually, at first you're like, oh no, that just sort of slipped through the editing process. But a lot of people actually loved the fact that mistake was integrated into the official video. I mean, they really loved it, and they thought that it made them feel like the clergy is just like everybody else, which of course we are. But to see some of that's a part of our life right now. And it was really, in retrospect, it was kind of a nice gift.
I think people do appreciate like the feeling normal based on the circumstances. Yeah. I mean, early on when I was recording these, I was in my household and a cat would come in and make noise, and I'd give her credit at the end for her appearance, but I think it normalizes things for people.
I mean, I can't tell you how many sermons have started, and then not 30 seconds into it, weed eaters are starting up right outside. I mean, right outside of the church windows, like in a way you can hear them, and you're like, okay.
Perfect timing as always.
Perfect timing, right?
So we're going to transition to Christmas here at the tail end. But so transitioning to Christmas, you told me when we were setting this up, and it really resonated with me that Christmas is the emotional center for many American Christians. We look at the Jewish calendar, and while Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are the high holy days, as relates to family and coming together, it's Passover and the recently completed or about to completed Hanukkah is in the same light because the household ritual and just the family connectivity. I really would love for you to tell us a bit more about what that, emotional center is like through your lens for American Christians.
I think really a similar dynamic is at work in our tradition too. There's just no question that, biblically speaking, from the New Testament's perspective and historically speaking, Easter is the theological center of Christianity. I mean, that is it is the queen of feasts. Everything else gets its definition and importance and meaning from that, and that's just true. But if you were to survey, most American Christians, I think Christmas would rank, number one. And it's not that it's not important. Obviously, it is theologically important too, but emotionally, it just is the most powerful moment of the year for most American Christians. And it is a little bit theological for most people, but a lot of it is cultural and sentimental and related to family history and memories of growing up as a child. I mean, it is a very, in a way, so much of it is oriented around children and awe and wonder in the world, and all of that is good. All of those are good things, but that's what kind of makes it rise to the top, I think, in the hearts of most American Christians. And there's a lot of good things that can be drawn out of that, but that's also where you get kind of the distortions of Christmas and the culture, and those things aren't always helpful. Having said that, it was interesting to start the pandemic with Easter, essentially, and most American Christians don't celebrate Easter the way that we do, the way that a lot of Roman Catholics do, and Lutherans as well, with a really powerful service on the night before Easter Day, kind of following like the Jewish way of thinking about time. And there is a service like Christmas Eve services at the church on the Saturday night before Easter Day. And we didn't do that in person. We did that over Zoom. With some parts were pre-recorded and some parts where people were reading the readings. Like we can choose all kinds of readings, but we must read about the going through the Red Sea. There's certain things that we have to read every year in that. And then I read a sermon, an ancient, short but ancient Easter sermon by St. John Chrysostom, and it really caught me off guard. We were in our front yard. We were in our front yard of the rectory, which is not too far from where the Hyones live, and we had a fire pit out there. We normally have a fire lit, new fire of the Easter in the church. But we had a fire pit in our front yard, and my family was there with me, and it was dark, and you could see the flames up behind me. And to read these ancient words about forgiveness and being set free, and finding joy and all of the kind of stuff, I got choked up reading them, and I didn't think that I would. I mean, it really hit me, and I think that was an unexpected gift of the pandemic, in that it wasn't what we're used to, it wasn't what we want, but in some ways it was one of the most powerful experiences of Easter that I've ever had.
Wow, that's a really powerful story. And you just referenced how Easter was different with you doing things on the lawn, and Christmas is certainly going to look different. I heard this actually at a Rice meeting, that you were going to do a drive-in service at Rice Stadium in the parking lot, and I know you're doing some other activities. So what are you hoping that those who can join for these opportunities are going to take away this year?
So we're going to have, it's not going to be a typical year. So usually we have on Christmas Eve, a whole series of services back to back. It's one of the most crowded times of any church, and people who are familiar to you are there, and people whom you've never seen are there, and people from the neighborhood are there. And that's just not going to happen in the same way this year. But the three opportunities we're going to have, one will be a pre-recorded service that will at least allow people to watch what they're used to. It'll be a traditional service all the things that we would normally have inside the church with all the beautiful music. And really, music is one of the things. Christmas carols are really a huge part of the experience of Christmas for most people. So that'll be offered on Christmas Eve at 7 p.m. On Christmas Day in the morning, we always have a small service on Christmas Day. And there may be more people who actually come this year. We'll have an outdoor service, weather permitting, at 10 a.m. on the south lawn. And but then the other thing that you referenced is the drive-in service using one of the parking lots near the Rice Stadium. And so this will be there'll be like 2 huge screens that are set up. A lot of it will be pre-recorded, people reading lessons from Scripture, and then followed by Christmas carols. So it's a variation on a service that's people often see in Advent or Christmas called Lessons and Carols. And then I'll be able to speak a little bit near the end of that. People will tune into the radio and be able to hear and sing along inside of their cars. So I think that it's the invitation to gather. I mean, it's not the same thing, but to gather together and to be able to sing, because that, again, not being able to sing together is one of the hardest things I think about experiencing Christmas this year. This is not quite the same thing, but it's a way to do that. And to realize that you're not alone. Advent is a season about preparing for that, talking about light shining in the darkness or dispelling the shadows. And I think just to know that you're not alone brings people great hope when they think about all those messages that they hear when they sing those songs together. And so people seem like they're really interested in that. Anyone can come. Rice is helping us out a little bit. And of course, anyone who's working on campus there, if that's part of their tradition, they're welcome to come and participate in that. So we'll see how that goes, and I'm really excited about it.
Well, we're gonna pray for good weather for sure.
Yes, thank you.
But as a logistical person, I'm very curious to learn how you determined what parts of your Christmas holiday experience would be in person in some form or fashion versus some of the other means, like you mentioned, the pre-recording. Were there certain elements that you really wanted to make sure that were part of the in-person experience or not? What was some of the thought process there?
Well, again, having that pre-recorded services that has all the pieces that people expect, that was important. Offering something that was in person, but it's not going to have the singing together, and that's a loss on Christmas Day. But if someone wants to receive communion, they have an opportunity to do that. It won't be the same experience because of they'll get to hear some music, but they won't be able to sing together the way that we're doing it. But the drive-in thing, they get to sing together, but they don't get to receive communion. So each of these you're trading one thing for another, and none of them are perfect. One of the things that we do include in our pre-recorded services for every Sunday, and that'll be a part of that Christmas Eve service, is we show a liturgy that shows the priest saying the prayers for Holy Communion, even though people aren't receiving Holy Communion. All right. So they're watching a ritual that they're not able to participate in at the end. But we do include what's called a prayer for spiritual communion, so that they, acknowledge what they're missing. And, it's a way of acknowledging and asking God to be present in their lives because they can't physically participate in that. So the real loss for us is not having all of those elements in the same time, not singing together and receiving communion and being together. You can have some of those, but not all of them. And so that's why we have the different, kind of offerings this year.
Yeah, no, I completely understand. I mean, you've brought up singing multiple times, and I know it pains our cantor to say at the beginning of the service for those who are in person, you can't sing, but feel free to move your hands, hands or wiggle around.
Right.
Certainly the people at home hopefully are singing louder than usual because there's no one around to hear.
That's right.
So 2 more questions. I always feel it's important to ask our guests because it's very topical across the board. what they think will stick once we emerge from COVID to whatever the new normal is. I mean, is there something that you
Sure.
have learned as maybe a trick, if you will, or something you've seen or done that is in it for the long haul that wasn't part of your arsenal per se prior
Yeah.
to this?
I pull out a couple things, and I'm sure there are others because we keep sort of making a list of this in response to this very question. But our weekly Bible studies have not only continued but actually thrived during the pandemic on Zoom, and that's been one of the most important ways for parishioners to remain connected in a group online, but still connected in a group outside of similar opportunities on Sundays. So that's been really wonderful. In fact, some of those groups have grown with people, who normally wouldn't be able to drive in early on a Tuesday morning or whenever else that those groups are meeting, or people who moved away, people who used to belong to Palmer, or relatives of people who participate in the group sometimes join. That's been really a joy to see. And one of the things that we're thinking about is having several rooms at the church that are equipped with the right kind of technology, so that on the other end of the pandemic, when those groups are regathering in person, when they're regathering physically, that we can continue to have that experience while at the same time offering it on Zoom. So that, again, people who are far away, or maybe their work schedules don't allow for that to happen, or they're shut in. And in a way, it really breaks open all of those conversations in a way that wasn't possible before. Well, it was possible before, and we just didn't do it. And so I think sort of ironing out those details, I'm really excited about that. And then along the same lines, what we had previously envisioned as a speaker series, monthly speaker series in person at Palmer, this past fall, way back when, that transitioned to a webinar series. And it's, along the same lines, that has really been the most unanticipated, that's the greatest unanticipated success of the pandemic, because it allowed us to invite different people into those conversations. It just wouldn't have been possible the way we were originally thinking about it. And so, one of our first conversation involved, it was with two people from Yale Divinity School, a theologian and a church historian. Then the next one was with an author in Charlottesville, Virginia. And then another was with Michael Curry, the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, whom many will remember as the preacher at the royal wedding of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. And then the last one was actually with Brene Brown. And that was the only one that we weren't allowed to advertise outside the congregation. But Brene is actually a Houston Episcopalian, and it was a remarkable opportunity to have a conversation with her about the world right now and church and faith. And so, I just look at all of that and marvel at why we didn't do this in the past, quite frankly. And like the Bible studies, I foresee continuing the webinars, even after we're able to gather a crowd together, say in our parish hall, even have a meal together beforehand. And then, you sit down for a conversation with me at the church, talking to someone in another part of the country, but also including people who aren't able to get to the church themselves or from all over the country. And so I think that's really exciting to just say that's a format we're going to continue with.
Yeah, I bring up all the time that barriers, whatever barrier there may be, geographic or otherwise, have all fallen, and people can engage and now know how to engage, even though some of us were on Zoom before this to some degree,
Right.
or on the streaming platforms. I really think everyone is taking advantage now. And then
before you go to your last question, I will also say that, committee meetings have taken place on Zoom. Some of those should continue on Zoom. Maybe not all of them, but I think some of them should continue on Zoom.
Is it okay? Do you give me permission to cut this little piece and put this on lay leadership? But no, I think you're right. I think, for people to schlep across town, and Houston can be difficult, particularly in the evening. If you don't have to meet in person, there's no reason to. And obviously you don't have to leave the lights on at our buildings and send staff home earlier. And I get there's times you have to meet in person.
That's right.
Definitely there's some pluses there. But lastly, to end on a positive note, I always feel it's important to do so. is there a story, and you've given some great personal anecdotes, some great stories about things you've been through, but is there something really that resonates with you that's going to stick with you for a long time that you're able to share with us from these last few months of the pandemic?
I think just a couple of things. I mean, first of all, to say that so many of the things that we've been doing, positive as they may be, have either been remote or indirect out of necessity. So we've had a couple of serve Sundays when we would normally worship together and then go out in groups to serve in various organizations around the city. And we didn't do that, during the pandemic. We did it virtually, where you maybe are invited to make a donation to an organization, or write notes to homeless people, or whatever it might be. A lot of that's been good and life-giving. But what I really appreciated was being able to host periodic blood drives in our parish hall in partnership with Gulf Coast Regional Blood Center. And that will continue in the new year. And so we'll just kind of put those on the calendar. And it's just because it's something concrete and physical and that you can do, that's not remote or indirect. For those who are able to participate in those blood drives, they're helping to save lives. They're making a real difference in the midst of the COVID-19 surge that we've now entered, and they're bringing light into the world in this Advent season. And I think in the same way, this week in particular, I don't know if you sort of were watching this or thinking about, but just seeing photos of all the physicians at Palmer and other physicians and nurses over at the medical center get their vaccines. I mean, the other day, it was like every hour, just throughout the whole day, you could watch those. And that watching those throughout the day was really more emotional for me than I thought it would be. And really, to me, seeing those photos felt like an act of prayer, and I do pray for them. And I think that was really, at least for me, a real moment of seeing light shine in our season of Advent.
Yeah, and I second that. I think it's so important and so powerful to see the images of our frontline people, our healthcare workers get the vaccine. I know some of our governmental leadership is as well, and hopefully seeing these people get their vaccine not only shines light, as you said, but encourages people, particularly in those groups that are less inclined to get vaccines, to get vaccinated, because it will go a long way. And then it was interesting that you brought up the blood bank, because I'm literally working on finalizing an interview with them next month, because I really think people need to hear about how access to giving blood is, what they can expect, and try to lower some barriers so people do give blood. So I appreciate you. We had some ESP going, and checking things off the block there. So thank you for coming on our broadcast today. I really think this is an informative broadcast that people will enjoy, and I really always love to learn what other faith groups are doing as relates to the holidays and the worship experience, because it gives thought to what I do and what David Tanner, who's behind the scenes, does. So thank you again for coming on.
Of course, this has been fun. Thanks for the invitation.
All right, well, I appreciate that. And again, thank you to David Tanner behind the scenes for his work on our broadcast. Our next edition of Conversations will be on Wednesday, January 13th at 12 p.m. as we welcome AJ Coffey, the Senior General Manager of Rice Village, on our show. And we're working on the blood guest, as I referenced. That will probably be January 27th. More details to come. And of course, as a reminder, you can catch any episodes you've missed of Conversations on the Emanu YouTube channel. Thanks for joining us today. We will see you next time in the new year. Take care, everybody.